the hypocrisy of the leaders, Luke, hopefully you notice, puts these two passages of these religious leaders right next to this poor widow. And I think what he's teaching us is that he wants our hearts completely and he wants our lives completely. But look at just the first verse here, okay, in Luke chapter 20, verse 45. It says this, "And in the hearing of all the people, he said to his disciples." Here's the thing. Okay, this morning is this little passage right here is the last passage in the Gospel of Luke where Jesus addresses the religious leaders. Here it says the scribes, but we know from actually even just this chapter, there's also the chief priests and the Sadducees, at least their representatives, and the Pharisees, and they're all there in the temple courts. And Jesus sort of has one last thing to say to them. And you might remember that, of course, during this Lenten season, we've seen a lot of conflict between these religious leaders and Jesus. I mean, just last week, we saw that the scribes and the chief priests, it said they sent spies to Jesus, and they were saying things like this, like, "Oh, you clearly talk from God, and so we must hear from you. Should we give taxes to Caesar?" But we know they were trying to catch him. And then we saw, of course, in the next paragraph, the Sadducees coming up and, we're going to ask him the trickiest question possible about the resurrection, and maybe this way we'll catch him. So we know there's all this tension that's going on, and the tension here is at a peak. And what Luke sort of wonderfully makes clear is that though Jesus is talking to his disciples, how he begins the paragraph is by saying, "And in the hearing of all of the people." So Jesus is actually just confronting this hypocrisy, not just sort of in the vague, but with the people right there in front of him who he's talking about. Which is to say, again, what you need to hear first this morning is that Jesus sees it and he hates it just as much as you do. And he calls it out. Here's what he says. "Beware of the scribes." Scribes would have been sort of the ones who knew the scriptures so well that they were consulted with regards to sort of legal dynamics with regards to the Old Testament scriptures, okay? Experts in the Bible, you could say, who like to walk around in long robes and love greetings in the marketplaces and the best seats in the synagogues and the places of honor at feasts, who devour widows' houses and for a pretense make long prayers. They will receive the greater condemnation. Here's what we see with these guys. Pious pomposity and pretentious profiteering. I thought of that myself because my name is Peter, and I'm a pastor who's a Presbyterian. So first, this first section here, Jesus gives a condemnation of them. These religious leaders, these experts in the law of God, these teachers who were to know the Holy Scriptures and apply it not just to their own lives, but to the life of their community. And he says, first, it's just because they're pompous. They're grand. Man, they are self-important. And he says, you know what, you can see this just by their clothes. That's the first thing he calls out. They like to walk around in long robes. I like to think it's a little bit longer than this, just so I feel better about myself right now. I know none of you are like eyeing my ministerial gown right now and going like, hey, where can I pick one of those up? But that back then, a long robe said a lot, okay? The length of your robe said how much manual labor you had to do in life. I mean, sometimes, like long gowns are hard to walk in. I've actually found that to be the case even with this ministerial gown occasionally. But ladies, you know that sometimes if you've got like a cocktail dress on, it can be tricky. And you never go weed your garden with a long dress on. And guys, I guarantee none of you like put on your suit and tie, something you'd wear to a wedding. And you're like, time to go mow the lawn. Nobody does that, okay? And nobody did it then. So in some ways, the length of your robe had to do with what you did, and at least you were above the people that worked in the ground. So you kind of looked down on them a little bit. And also the length of your robe had to do with what kind of how much fabric you could afford. So it kind of made you feel better about yourself. Some of you, I would bet a lot of you, have seen the Instagram account, Preachers in Sneakers. If you haven't, you should check it out. It's both depressing and mostly depressing. It highlights preachers and their designer fashion. One pastor was preaching in rare off-white Nike Air Force Ones that cost a mere $2,500. Another pastor highlighted on that Instagram account was preaching in a Louis Vuitton suede jacket that ran a mere $4,800. And you see these and you go, what? Really? And Jesus did too. His world isn't terribly distant. So Jesus is calling out their sort of pomposity. They're grand. They're a big deal, and they wanted everyone to know it. But here's an interesting thing. Some people didn't think that the long robes necessarily had to do with them showing off what they could afford, but actually how righteous they were. So some of you might know this, but in the book of Numbers in chapter 15, there's actually a command given to Moses to have tassels on the edges and the ends of your garments. And what those tassels were supposed to do were to remind you of the law of God. They were given there sort of like a monument to say, hey, I've given you the law, and this will help you remember that. And so these people didn't just have tassels, but they had them going as long as possible, all the way down to the ground, so that everybody else knew, well, these guys take God really seriously. They're a big deal religiously. They would talk about how long and how consistent they were with deep and intense quiet times. How many books they were reading, how consistent they were at every church event, how perfectly quiet their children were, and how much their children just couldn't wait to get in the car every Sunday morning to go to church. You know, these are the ones who are always somehow working the Bible into every single sentence with their coworkers. They knew the law of God, and they wanted everybody to know it. They're piously pompous. Jesus goes on to say that they love greetings in the marketplaces. There's actually an account of a couple rabbis who were miffed. They were aggrieved and they were bewildered because they were going to meet one another, and this is actually a rabbinical account. They were going to meet one another, and on their way, they passed by a bunch of people, and they were recounting to each other, and they said that these people would pass them by, and they said this, "May your peace be great." Sounds nice enough, but these guys were miffed because the people that passed them by in the street did not add what was a customary addition to that greeting, which was, "My master." My master. So not only did they want to be greeted, but they wanted to be greeted with "my master." And these people got the nice seats at church and the best seats at the dinner parties. Maybe some of you have heard recently that Hillsong in New York City, which is now closed because of other controversies, had a VIP sitting area in the very front. None of our VIP people showed up today. Our first two pews are empty. But this is where Justin Bieber and other folk would sit when they went to Hillsong in New York City. If you were a celebrity, you could sit up front. And if you think that's crazy, well, actually, most of you may know this. Many, many, many churches, particularly in Great Britain and the United States, had pews that you would pay for, and that's where you would sit. And that existed really up until just after the Civil War. Here's something interesting that you may not know. For the great majority of the life of the church, there were no chairs and no pews in sanctuaries, all the way up through the Reformation. John Calvin, if you were worshiping at John Calvin's church in Geneva, you would have stood the entire time. Really. I mean, the pews are a fairly modern invention, and of course they cost a lot of money to make. And so if you could afford one, You would buy a fairly nice one, and often they were boxes, so other people wouldn't get into your box, or maybe so you could just keep your children in. That's probably what they were for. And you would pay more money for the ones that were closer up. Okay? Mark Twain actually went into a church in Manhattan that was still doing this, and he wandered down the aisle and he took a seat in an empty pew. And when the family that actually owned this, little box and pew came, they just crowded in with Mark Twain. And here's what happened. This is what I read. The father, the head of that family there, handed Mark Twain a little piece of paper. And on that paper it said, "Do you know how much I paid for this pew?" And supposedly on that paper, he had written the number that he had paid for that pew. And pardon Mark Twain's French, but Mark Twain said, "You paid too damn much." So what I'm again suggesting to you is that this is not a distant world from our own. It's actually not. This is not something that's crazy, what Jesus is dealing with here with these men. We hear these things and we have the exact same response that Jesus had. This should not be the case. These people who are to be experts in the law of God, who were sought out to guide the community in the way of the Lord, using their power, a leader in the family of God, ought never to use his power and his standing for his own gain. And this is the case not just for leaders. I mean, this is a good word for me, but we all know this, right? That Christians should be marked by those who love well, who serve sacrificially, who pursue justice and righteousness, who are quick to forgive, who are eager to give rather than to take, who are slow to speak and quick to listen, who think of others more highly than themselves. Things that we sort of all instinctively know, those should be the marks of the people of God. Yet, I'm reading a book right now that's called Celebrities for Jesus. Maybe you've seen it. It's by Katie Beattie. She explores in that book how the church, just like society at large, is absolutely sort of fixated on status and power, fame, what we can have and control. She works for Christianity Today, and she talks about how years ago, actually in 2014, she had actually received a tip on a certain story about this very, very well-known Christian apologist, this global audience that this man had. And she had heard that this man had had affairs around the world and that he owned his own sort of massage parlor down in Atlanta, and some sketchy things had happened. It was a tip. And so she actually got to interview somebody that was really high up in this man's organization. And she actually asked this person if there was any truth to these, rumors, this tip that she had heard. And of course, the person denied it, right? This man has defended the gospel in such secular cultures. He's written book after book. I mean, people go to him to have answers to the hard questions of life. He's a scribe. Of course, probably most of you know that it was found out that for all of his importance, Ravi Zacharias lived a massively double life. And he used his position of power within the church for abuse. None of the stuff that we're hearing here in Luke is at all distant from our experience now.